infrastructure projects. Right now, we are in the phase 1 or milestone number 1 of the approach that was taken by the IAEA, which is informed or knowledgeable commitment towards energy development. So as far as renewable energy development is concerned, and vis-a-vis the nuclear, it complements because nuclear power is stable and base load, and the variable in terms of dispatch of energy can support the power. So this is also consistent with the government, particularly the DOE's thrust of energy security. So we need to provide supply of electricity to our consumers 24/7, 365 days in 1 year. So that is part of us. And rest assured that we're doing all the transparency as well as decision-making as far as the establishment of nuclear energy program in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Asek. So this is also in keeping with the President's vision to have a healthy energy mix in order to address the energy needs of the country. We'll go back to that conversation also. I'm sure we would like to talk about that with the Climate Change Commissioner here. Let's first move on to DILG. Para sa kaalaman ng lahat, ang DILG ay nakikibahagi rin sa kampanya sa pagtitipid ng tubig. Please tell us more about DILG's initiatives in water conservation and other campaigns in environmental protection.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Daphne. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Much earlier when we received the advisory from DOST Pag-asa that we'll be experiencing El Nino in the coming months, upon the directive of our Secretary, Attorney Benjamin C. Abalos Jr., the DILG issued a memorandum circular for the guidance of all our local government units. Particularly, we urge our local government units to come up with policies and enact ordinances for the prudent use of water. Because we believe that, we know, of course, that with El Nino, the result will be less rainfall, which would further result to less stream flows and groundwater. And it will practically affect our supply of water. So part of the guidance that we gave to our local government units is to come up with policies and ordinances for the prudent use of water. Particularly, we highly encourage our local government units to allow water concessionaires to fix leaks in water pipelines. Now, even while the permits for the digging of the roads is yet to be issued by local government units. We also urge our LGUs to do intense advocacy to their constituents, particularly, as minor as fixing the leaks in our faucets. It could seem inconsequential, but if we lump all the households in the entire country, it would we would come up with a large volume of saved water. So as simple as that, these are things that our local government units have been doing for quite some time. Also, per the directive of the Secretary, the Bureau of Fire Protection will only draw water from water hydrants if necessary. So the BFP has that guidance from the Secretary. On environmental protection, the DILG is a key agency in the implementation of the Supreme Court decision to have a Manila Bay clean-up, recovery, and rehabilitation. We have 187 local government units which is within the Manila Bay area. And part of our collaboration with our local government units and other national government agencies is the conduct of yearly environmental compliance audit. So the last audit that we came up with resulted to like 181 out of 187 cities and municipalities have come up with their sewage and septage management ordinance. 88% of the business establishments, 89% of the factories, and 77% of households have already established their sewage treatment plant or have their own septic tanks. 181 local government units have already their approved solid waste management plan approved by the National Solid Waste Commission, and 165 local government units have already their material recovery facility. These initiatives would contribute to addressing the factors and the practices that contributed to the degradation of Manila Bay. So as I mentioned, in coordination with other national government agencies, we will be monitoring the adherence to these policies by our local government units, and we do it yearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary. At this point, we are now joined live by the Secretary of the DANR, Maria Antonia Yulo Loizaga, and Secretary Gilberto Teodoro of the Department of National Defense, who are both currently at the Department of National Defense, managing the situation with Typhoon Egay. Thank you, sir and ma'am, for joining us. We know your time is very limited at the moment, so I'll get right into the discussion. First question for DENR Secretary. The President said, considering its fundamental importance, water security deserves our special focus. Our efforts must not be scattershot, but rather cohesive, centralized, and systematic. On July 4th, 2023, Pag-asa declared the start of the El Niño phenomenon. Daily water interruptions started to decrease water level dams around the country. What are the programs being implemented by the government, led by the Water Resources Management Office, or DENR, to ensure water supply?
Thank you very much, Daphne, and good afternoon to everyone. As you know, the WRMO, or the Water Resources Management Office, was organized by executive order to actually coordinate the functions of all the water-related agencies, of which there were more than 20, as you know, in order for us to achieve what we call an integrated water resource management approach to our water security. That means equity, economic efficiency, and environmental sustainability are at the heart of the government's water security program. So in terms of our water security efforts, let me start with the immediate. The WRMO has issued 2 bulletins already. One first, basically to government offices, and the rest for the general public to warn on the impacts of El Niño. This means that conservation is at the top of our list. We do know that there are problems in infrastructure, as well as, of course, the problems of supply because of the decreased rainfall amount. So infrastructure, whether it's the major infrastructure of distribution or whether it's the pipes leading to your very home and your own usage, as Yusek Iringan has already mentioned, we'd like to plug the leaks wherever possible, and this is something that every household can do. We also need to collect and impound water, and so we're working with the DPWH to see whether we can have some of the flood control projects, in fact, be also water impounding projects, to see whether those can be stored for the coming months and years because of climate change and its impacts. Thirdly, we're looking for funding resources and, of course, for cooperation of the local governments. And here's where it gets very interesting for us. We would like, for example, and this is largely through the convergence of the different departments in this administration, led by the DPWH and, of course, NEDA. We have LUA and MWSS also participating, looking at our budgets and our programs to see how we can design multi-purpose infrastructure to actually serve the different needs of agriculture, of power, of water for domestic use, of industry. And so we're looking at this infrastructure that is multi-purpose in order to address the different dimensions of water security in the country. Thirdly, in terms of the longer term, funding is, of course, a question. So we're now working with the DOF to see how we might be able to incentivize PPPs for bulk water and other projects that could, in fact, deliver water where it is most needed. And lastly, we're looking at our development partners, such as the World Bank, for example, who are actually interested in looking at multi-purpose infrastructure funding for us to be able to address, especially those that are critically in danger because of climate change. So these are a whole range of projects, and we hope that, in fact, by August, we'll be able to release our Integrated Water Resources Management Plan. The consultations have already been completed, and therefore that new plan will be released for everyone to examine. Thanks, Daphne.
Thank you, Secretary Tony. Let's move on to Secretary Teodoro. Sir, In the Philippines, climate emergencies, natural disasters are not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And currently we have one right now, and I hope it's not so bad. But seeing as the Philippines is highly exposed to natural hazards, what is the DND doing to strengthen the country's disaster preparedness and resiliency? Go ahead, sir.
Well, great strides have been made by our partner agencies with the primary responsibility for preparedness and resiliency, namely, of course, the DILG, because the first responders are the local government units. In case of predictive capabilities for natural calamities, a lot has been done by the DOST through FIVOX and PAGASA, and the DPWH in terms of mitigating and resiliency too, and the DNR. Now, on our part, what we want to be is the bridge between concerted national government assistance and efforts in all these aspects and the local government units. That is what the Office of Civil Defense is all about. So it's a matter of marshalling and coordinating all efforts. And I forgot to mention our very energetic DSWD partner, Secretary Rex Gatchalian, who also has a great deal to do on preparedness and response, and rehabilitation too. So what the OCD is doing is to increase its coordinative functions to get us reliable and timely information and analyze this in as much a real-time situation or scenario as possible for concerted efforts of the national government in case a local government unit cannot cope with a natural or a man-made disaster. That being the case too, we continue also to partner with international humanitarian agencies and response agencies to advocate with the rest of the national government in best practices in disaster risk reduction. That being said, in the DND proper, the Armed Forces of the Philippines too does big share of helping our people in times of crisis and in terms of delivering basic goods and services when communities are isolated, as we see now. We also want to report that last Sunday, under EO24, the National Task Force on Crisis Management for Response was convened by the Executive Secretary, and we held our first joint NDRRMC and Task Force meeting today to study the effects and to coordinate the efforts on Typhoon Egay and the southwest monsoon that it brings, and another tropical disturbance which is forming in the area of southeastern Philippines. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you, Secretary Teodoro. Right now, let's move to DSWD. Okay, the President said we have learned many painful lessons from past disasters. We continue to be alert and prepared in our disaster response. It has, in fact, been commented that sometimes we are over-prepared for such natural disasters. To continue that, we are reorganizing our response teams to make them more adaptable, agile, and effective in times of calamities and crises. With a clear unity of command. What are the efforts undertaken by your agency to ensure immediate and faster delivery of relief assistance and services to the affected communities, DSWD? And feel free to come in again, Secretary Teodoro or DILG as well.
Well, Daphne, you'll hear this word over and over again in our programs, handa, prepared. In the department, in DSWD, we encapsulated our program in a program called Buong Bansa Handa. We believe that disaster preparedness and response is not just the government's responsibility, but it's every single Filipino's responsibility. Now, for the department, at least we are in charge of the response, making sure that the immediate needs or the immediate relief will be there, the humanitarian side of it. And DSWD has formulated a plan based on the President's instruction to come up with fail-safe mechanisms for our supply chain. The goal there is to be omnipresent, so to speak, making our people, most especially the victims, feel that government is there in fact, ahead, during, and right after a storm or a natural calamity. So in the Buong Bansa program, Buong Bansa Handa program, we created 2 supply chains. The first supply chain is a government supply chain. It's government-driven, wherein we tap into the warehouse facilities of local government units, provincial governments, other agencies like DND led by Secretary Teodoro, who lent us a couple of warehouses. So we started pre-positioning goods to all our regional offices and as far as we can in the provincial offices. As we speak right now, for instance, we have around 1.3 million family food packs spread across the entire country, ready on the ground, so that when typhoons like Egay hit, it's not like we're marshalling things always out of Metro Manila or the urban centers, but the goods are already there. That's part of being omnipresent. But we also know that if we just use government resources, it won't be enough. That's why in Buong Bansa Handa, we procured the services through framework agreements or supply agreements of the private sector. People or companies who are in the food distribution business, grocers. We know that their expertise or their infrastructure is more superior. We plotted out their presence nationwide and they can fill in the gaps where we don't have government facilities or warehouses. So we're in the process of procuring that and it should come to a fore very shortly. That will complement the government-driven supply chain line that we created and thereby now creating 2 supply chain lines. One, government-driven, the other private sector-driven. We'll lean on these 2 supply chain lines to make sure that government relief efforts or government relief packs are spread across the entire country as widespread as we can, because that's about being prepared, getting the private sector involved as well as making sure that government is omnipresent in the farthest areas of the country where a disaster can strike anytime.
Okay. Secretary Teodoro, would you like to add to that?
Add that the coordination between the Department of Social Welfare and Development, of course, anchored on the much improved predictive capabilities of Pag-asa and PhilVox, has allowed us to adequately plan beforehand and marshal our resources more efficiently in order to serve our people in a faster manner. And it is a testament to the close coordination between cabinet members that we are able to function this efficiently. And we hope to institutionalize these practices so that the continuing delivery of services for our countrymen in need, when they need it, comes at a quicker pace because of pre-planning and pre-positioning without wastage, of course.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now let's move on to the Climate Change Commission. Of course, all of this whole-of-nation approach is needed to fully respond to the impact of climate change. For the CCC, what are the country's policies on addressing climate change, such as the National Climate Change Action Plan? What is the status of the local action plans of the LGUs? And despite being one of the lowest contributors to carbon emissions, the Philippines remains committed to the 2015 Paris Agreement. For the CCC, what are the policy measures to accelerate decarbonization efforts, and any updates on the country's implementation of the nationally determined contribution?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for that question. First and foremost, I'd like to say that the Climate Change Commission is very much encouraged by the presence of the different agencies here. It goes to show that it is indeed a whole-of-government approach in order to address not just the issue of climate change, but other issues of governance. But we'd like to say that the climate change is the governance challenge of our generation. And if we can stretch it a little bit further, instead of simply a whole-of-society or a whole-of-nation approach, we would say that it's a whole-of-world approach, because the problem of climate change is global, it's historic, and it's also systemic. And I think it puts a very good context to the work that we do if we also understand not just the responsibilities of the Philippines as a party to the UNFCCC, but also the responsibilities and commitments of the developed countries or industrialized countries that have been historically responsible for climate change. Now, that being said, there are several policy frameworks already that have been implemented and put in place, including the National Framework for NFSS. We also have the National Climate Change Action Plan, of course, and we have our nationally determined contributions that sets an ambitious goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 75%. But again, we have to understand that the 75% reduction is dependent on more than 72% is dependent on the assistance being given by our partner countries in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. With that being said, it's also important that we understand that we have our nationally NDC implementation plan that's currently undertaken by the CCC. And it's important to note that what we have under President Marcos is truly a whole of government, whole society approach that is based on nature-based solutions. And with guidance from SENR, we're able to work right now also on the National Adaptation Plan, which its main objective is to make sure that we have a framework and a plan for the country, for our LGUs and our agencies to truly help where it matters. It's important to note also that under this administration, we have been making good headways in our greenhouse gas inventory. And we're working on completing we've already done the 2010, but right now we're completing 2015 and 2020. Why is this important? It's important because the different sectors in the Philippines need to understand the trajectory of our industries, and we need to accordingly plan for that. And I think it's going to be a major accomplishment of the Marcos administration once we get up to date on our 2015 and 2020 greenhouse gas inventory. But that said, there are a couple of questions there. We'd like to focus on the communities and LGUs, and we've been working very closely with the Department of Interior and Local Government on the Local Climate Change Action Plan. Right now, what we have is 85% compliance with the LC cap. But is that enough? No. What we want is 100% compliance with the Local Climate Change Action Plan. And when we speak about this, it was explicitly said by Secretary Yulo Luizaga that it's important, as she is the representative of the President to the Climate Change Commission, it's important to study not only the quantity, but also the quality of the local climate change action plans. Why? Because it's in the grassroots that climate change is truly felt. And what we're doing right now, together with the DILG, is to make sure that the submissions are both qualitatively and quantitatively good. So these are some of the measures that we have under President Marcos that we're working on in terms of strengthening the actions for climate change. And might we say again, that it's important for us to really understand that when we talk about climate change, it's the lives and the livelihood and the future of our country. And President Marcos has been very clear on his vision and marching orders for this.
Thank you, Commissioner Borge. You mentioned the National Adaptation Plan and its the importance of the LGUs, and of course this is all anchored with the DENR. So let's go back to Secretary Loizaga. What are the DENR's efforts to promote collaboration among the national and local government, private sector and public to strengthen solid waste management and address plastic pollution, and I suppose as well climate resiliency? Any focus on mitigation and adaptation measures?
Let me start with the solid waste question. As you know, we do have a national solid waste management law, and all the LGUs are mandated to submit their plans to the council, which is the National Solid Waste Management Council. All of these plans have to carry their own estimates moving forward for 10 years in terms of the way their waste will be generated, the kind of waste, the budgets they expect to actually earmark, and of course what it is that they will actually do with that waste. Right now, most of the LGUs are using their sanitary landfill facilities. They locate these within their own properties, their political administrative boundaries, but we know there are challenges. There are challenges in segregation. There are challenges as well in identifying land that will be suitable for these landfills. So there are new solutions that we're beginning to look at. Some of the LGUs have now been working with cement companies, for example, that use the solid waste in their co-processing in order to use that as fuel for their own generation of their product. What this does for cement companies, it decarbonizes them slowly, but what this does also for the LGUs is it gives them a solution where they are short of land and short of technical expertise to actually handle their solid waste problems. Now, on the private sector as a whole, and this is where it gets very, very important that this administration has actually seen the passage into law of the Extended Producers Responsibility Act. Now, that requires all producers using plastic packaging to collect their packaging at the rate of 20% a year until they reach 80% collection. The accountability and the responsibility for the recycling, and the reduction of their plastic packaging now is in the hands of those that are actually producing and using the plastic packaging. This is very important because at the end of the day, we know that we cannot collect all of this plastic packaging and, of course, dispose of them adequately because plastic doesn't degrade. Depending on the type of plastic packaging that you use, it will take hundreds of years before you can actually be rid of it. So the private sector's responsibility is very, very important in this whole effort, but we need to work with local governments as well. It is very much a multi-stakeholder, whole of government, whole of society effort in order to address plastic waste. And here's where we need to also, at this point, begin to think of who are involved in the solid waste management sector and make that an industry in itself. Why that's important is this. There is a whole group of informal sector participants in the solid waste management activities of our country. These individuals, these families, many of them lived for generations beside the large landfills that we know. They need to be given a fair wage. They need to be valued for their contribution to the solid waste management effort of this country. And that means they need social protection, they need the just pay that they actually should receive, and they need occupational hazard and safety training in order for them to actually be more protected against the hazards of this actual profession. So let's not forget that the private sector, the local governments, they're key actors, but we need to also include in this particular problem of solid waste management the role of the different partners and contributors to what we see as a value chain for the solid waste management industry, if you will, and to give those sectors a fair wage and the social protection and the benefits that they need. Lastly, I would like to say that marine plastic litter is a big issue for us. We are now baselining and actually looking at methodologies as to how we can baseline our marine plastic litter. The development partners have been very, very generous with us in trying to work with us, not just the UN agencies, but organizations like the World Economic Forum. We are working with all of these groups in order for us to establish the baseline for marine plastic litter, and then look at the methodologies for us, not just to be picking it up when it's already in the ocean, but of course to prevent it from actually reaching our rivers and streams. This is a whole of society effort. It can't just be the government. And we look across our different department partners as well as the local governments vertically to help us in this regard. Thanks, Daphne.
Thank you, Secretary Loizaga. Sabi nga ni Pangulong Marcos, we can never lose sight of our responsibility to the future. The economic agenda cannot and will not ever be incompatible with our climate change agenda. Climate change is now an important criterion in our integral national policies in planning, decision-making, up to the implementation of programs. And with that, maraming salamat sa ating panel ngayon. Thank you especially to Secretary Teodoro and Secretary Loizaga, who's currently handling a disaster management situation. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we head on full speed to a modern and bagong Pilipinas, disaster resiliency, dealing with climate change, pushing for clean energy production, and government assistance during times of calamities will remain key areas for our sustained progress through, of course, our dynamic environmental protection and disaster management cluster. Join us again later at 4 p.m. for the last session. We will tackle the administration's report card on good governance, peace, and security. This has been Daphne Oceania Paez. Thank you for joining us in the 2023 Post-SONA discussions.